I particularly like this group and the fact that we have many populist movements happening, little grassroots movements going on. I've written 11 books, and my first 10 were on health, so I was in the alternative health field and the politics of health and cancer and so forth. And I read this somewhere that the doctors were all marching in lockstep because they'd all essentially been brainwashed in medical school, and they all stood behind each other. And the alternative people are all mavericks. You know, they're all very clever in their own way, but they're all going in different directions. And so they were their own worst enemies. They all thought the others were quacks. But right now, as Peter says, we are living in critical times, and we have to all get together. So I just had this vision of all these little grassroots movements that it's like a tuning fork. You know, if you can get all those movements together, you could overwhelm the other side. I mean, you need this great wave, this tsunami-like wave. And so I think you all are starting that sort of thing here. That's my sense. Okay. I'm going to speak on the financial meltdown, why it happened, and how it can be reversed. I'm going to go farther than to suggest that we can merely get back to where we were before this meltdown occurred. I'm going to suggest that we can have it all. We can reduce or eliminate taxes. We can reduce or eliminate the federal debt. We can increase social services. We can develop our infrastructure, and we can do it without merely shuffling the money around from the rich to the poor. We can increase abundance for all. And we can do it by fixing the fundamental systemic flaw in our banking system. Sorry? Well, he said it can't be done, I guess. Yeah, sorry.
Interesting.
Okay.
You can't?
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll just do it. Some people criticize the idea that you can actually create abundance by increasing the money in the system. But I'm going to argue that that's exactly how you increase abundance. The problem with our current system is there's no real money in it. Our entire money supply, except for coins, consists of debt to private banks. It's a 300-year Ponzi scheme, and it's now imploding. And so it's critical that we have another system in place, one that's mathematically sound, before the old one collapses, or we are liable to degenerate into civil unrest and a police state. The solution of the banks today, or the Treasury and the Federal Reserve today, is to pour billions and now trillions of dollars at the banks. But that's actually just feeding the problem. We're giving them the resources to spread the disease to other smaller banks, which they're buying out, and they're continuing to speculate as they were before. The bank bailout is the largest government project in history. These are actually in inflation-adjusted prices. If you put together the Marshall Plan, the Louisiana Purchase, sorry, I can't even read, the Moonshot, the Savings and Loan Crisis, the Korean War, the New Deal, the Iraq War, the Vietnam War, NASA, all together came to $4 trillion. That's in inflation-adjusted prices. And when this chart was made, it was $4.5 trillion for the bank bailouts. And it's gotten worse. It started out at $700 billion when Henry Paulson essentially extorted that first bailout in September. By October, when it was passed, it was up to $800 billion with the pork added. And then, according to the LA Times, by November 30th, there were $8.5 trillion in loans, commitments, and guarantees covered by the bailout. And that wasn't even including Obama's stimulus package, which adds another $900 billion. So you're over $9 trillion. where is this money going to come from? This is the breakdown in the LA Times. These are all loans to private corporations, not to the government, but loans to banks, credit card companies, AIG, which is an insurance company, etc. $9 trillion is the size of the federal debt in 2007, and it had been growing since 1940, which is 67 years. Actually, it had been growing since 1838. Our debt has not been paid off since Andrew Jackson, 1838. But you can see that since 1940, it's grown exponentially. So we would be doubling the size of the federal debt in the space of a few months if it were the taxpayers who were going to pay this. But in fact, it's not the taxpayers. It's the Federal Reserve that is apparently the intended payor. But then the question is, where does the Federal Reserve get the money? Normally, their assets have stayed pretty stable. In 2007, they had $850 billion, most of which were government securities. In 2008, their government securities had dropped down substantially, but they still had about the same in assets. What they had done was they had traded the government securities for this dodgy collateral on the bank's books, trying to clean up the bank's books. But in January of 2009, something extraordinary happened. Suddenly, an additional $1.2 trillion appeared on the books of the Federal Reserve. It went to $2.1 trillion in assets and $2.1 trillion in liabilities. And again, these are all loans. They're counting these as assets. These are loans to private banks, private corporations, private credit card companies. When Bloomberg News brought a Freedom of Information Act request to find out who this money was going to and where it was coming from and what the collateral was, the Federal Reserve said that they refused to produce the documents. They said that most of the documents were held by the New York Federal Reserve, which is not a federal agency and therefore not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. That was their first defense. Their second defense was that the documents involved protected trade secrets. Well, the question is, whose trade secrets and what secrets? In fact, the biggest trade secret of the banks is that they do not have the money. They never had the money. They create the money they lend on their books. This is a famous statement by Sir Josiah Stamp, governor of the Bank of England, the second richest man in Britain in the 1920s. He said in 1927, "The modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented. Banking was conceived in inequity and born in sin. Bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money, and with a flick of a pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again." So with that introduction, these are the points I'm going to cover this evening. The problem and the solution. The problem is our money is an illusion. Our entire money supply is created through sleight of hand as a debt to private banks, all except for coins. The current banking system is a Ponzi scheme, which has reached its mathematical limits. It must end badly unless we act quickly to replace it with something better. And there is something better. The real non-illusory money first invented by the American colonists, issued publicly by the community. Greater abundance is possible for all. The system is not utopian and it's not new. It has been tested historically, and it works. Contrary to popular belief, our dollars are not issued by the federal government. These are what our government issues. They're pink pieces of paper called bonds or securities, government securities, or debt. Then the government trades those pink pieces of paper for green pieces of paper called Federal Reserve notes, which are issued by the Federal Reserve, obviously, which is a private banking corporation. The Federal Reserve gets the green notes for the cost of printing them, about 6 cents a bill. And we, the people, get it for the face amount of the bill, which is, in this case, $100. So you might wonder, well, why do you always see the Bureau of Engraving and Printing? You know, you see those pictures of the printing press, and everybody thinks, well, that's the government printing them. Well, it is the government printing them, but it's the Federal Reserve that is like the customer that goes to the Bureau of Engraving and Printing and says, print print up some bills and they get them for 6 cents each. So all that would be all right if the Federal Reserve were actually federal, but it isn't. It is owned by a consortium of private banks. Moreover, Federal Reserve notes only compose 3% of the money supply. This is M1, M2, M3, when reported by the Federal Reserve when they used to report M3, which they quit doing recently, well, I think in 2006 or 7. They quit reporting it because they said that, there's now a quadrillion-dollar derivative scheme out there. So they said you couldn't define what money was. There was no way to tell where to put the limit on money. In other words, it's all an illusion, and you've got illusions on top of illusions. But anyway, here's the question. If 3% of that's up to here, this is where the Federal Reserve notes go to. What is all this? That is all created by banks in the form of loans. They create it on their books. Many authorities have attested to this. I'll just read a couple. Wright Patman was chairman of the U.S. House Banking and Currency Committee in the 60s. He said, when the Federal Reserve writes a check for a government bond, it does exactly what any bank does. It creates money. It created money purely and simply by writing a check. Maybe I'll skip that one. Graham Towers was governor of the Bank of Canada. He said, banks create money. That is what they are for. The manufacturing process to make money consists of making an entry in a book. That is all. Each and every time a bank makes a loan, new bank credit is created, brand new money. Robert Hemphill was credit manager for the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta in the Depression. He said, we are completely dependent on the commercial banks. Someone has to borrow every dollar we have in circulation, cash or credit. If the banks create ample synthetic money, we are prosperous. If not, we starve. And this is from the Federal Reserve itself in a booklet called Modern Money Mechanics. It said, the actual process of money creation takes place primarily in banks. Banks do not really pay out loans from the money they receive as deposits. If they did this, no additional money would be created. What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes in exchange for credits to the borrower's accounts. Loans or assets and deposits or liabilities both rise by the same amount. So this is how it's done, double entry bookkeeping. If you go to the bank with your you want a $500,000 mortgage. So you'll sign this piece of paper called a mortgage. And that's a negotiable instrument with a present value. So the bank will write that up on one side of their books as an asset to themselves because you will pay that over time. It's an income generating asset for them. Then on the other side of their books, they'll write it up as a liability to themselves because they're going to write that number into your account and you now can write checks on it. And that is the source of our money supply. So the bank, when the banker, when he looks at his books at the end of the day, he says, well, they balance. It's a plus 500 and minus 500. He says he hasn't created anything. It all comes out to zero. But in fact, that 500,000 is what goes out into the economy and trades as money. The key to this whole system is the reserve requirement, which is another misconception. The reserve requirement is set by the Federal Reserve. This is put out by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. It says, if the reserve requirement is 10%, for example, a bank that receives a $100 deposit may lend out $90 of that deposit. If the borrower then writes a check to someone who deposits the $90, a bank receiving that deposit can lend out $81 and so forth. So it keeps increasing until $100 becomes $1,000. And in Modern Money Mechanics, the Chicago Federal Reserve said, with a uniform 10% reserve requirement, a $1 increase in reserves would support $10 of additional transaction accounts. Now you would think that what that means, and this is what most people think. My son is a graduate student in economics, and this is the way he learned it, that if you have a $10,000 deposit in the bank, people think that that means that you can lend out $9,000 of that and you keep $1,000 in the bank. But that's obviously not what happens here. This $10,000 never leaves the bank. That's the depositor's money. And you never go to the bank and they say, I'm sorry, we just lent your money out to Mr. Smith for 30 years, so you'll have to come back later. They always have your money. So what they've done is they've created another $9,000 on top of that $10,000. And then when that money goes out and it gets deposited in that bank or another bank, and then they create $8,100 on top of that, and then they create 90% of that, and so on. It goes up about 20 times until it becomes $100,000. Now that's obviously highly inflationary. And this is a chart of the money supply, which you notice looks a lot like the federal debt. Oh, this is the federal debt. No, I'm sorry, this is the money supply. Okay, but you can see how inflationary it is. In fact, there's a series of exponential curves. This is the devaluation of the dollar. So it's an exponential curve going the other way. As the money supply increases, the value of the dollar goes down. This is the miracle of compound interest, another exponential curve. It's called a miracle if you're the lender. If you're the borrower, it's not so good. You can see on this chart, if you, starting down here, if you put $10,000 into a 6% investment, say when you're 25, at the beginning of your working career, 40 years later, you take it out, your $10,000 at a mere 6% interest becomes $100,000. Well, that is rather miraculous if it's your $10,000. But then where did that $90,000 come from? It either had to have been taken from someone else, or the money supply had to have inflated in order to create that money. And in fact, that is why you couldn't have an all-gold system. If you had an all-gold system, in other words, if the money supply could not expand and you allowed lending at interest, at 6% interest, let's say you let lenders lend out 10% of the money supply, and they continually rolled over principal and interest. They were always fully loaned up, which is what bankers try to do. So if they kept rolling over that money, in a mere 40 years, they would own all the gold. And in fact, this has happened historically in the 13th century when the king needed gold and they didn't have it in England because it had all left for the Crusades. So they readmitted the moneylenders. You know, they were periodically banned and then they were let back in. So they let the moneylenders in because to lend their gold out. Oh, good. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Great. They let the moneylenders in, and they quickly wound up with all the gold. And so the people rioted because they were winding up in debtor's prison or debt peonage. So the king then evicted the moneylenders again, and they weren't allowed back in the country until the 17th century. Oops, going the wrong way. So the secret of the usury system's success is also its Achilles heel, or its fatal flaw. It's a pyramid scheme. So you have to continually have new borrowers coming in at the bottom in order to support the lenders at the top. This is because bankers create the principal, but they don't create the interest necessary to pay back their loans. So, and since bank-created debt money is the only source of money in the system, except for coins, which are mere tokens, somebody somewhere has to continually be taking out another loan just to create the money, to create the interest, to service the old debt that is our money supply. This system has been in existence for 300 years, since the Bank of England, 1694, and it's now gone around the world. So all third world countries are pretty well locked in debt. And then now all first world countries are locked in debt. And then they got all the prime borrowers, and then they hit the subprime borrowers. And when they ran out of those, they developed a derivative scheme on top of that. So this is the problem, that the entire world has been locked in debt, and the system has reached the end of its mathematical possibilities. This is on the one side, this is the interest on the federal debt, another exponential curve, and then that one's the federal debt itself, also an exponential curve. Oh dear. This is an exponential curve plotted mathematically. Normally, it would go to infinity. It would just go straight up. But if you have a finite food source, say you're a parasite, or if you have a finite number of borrowers, then at some point you'll hit the wall and it'll drop right back down. And that's where we are. You can tell from all these curves that we're at the top end of that exponential curve. You can also tell by comparing those curves that the federal debt is basically the money supply. And the reason is that if all money is debt, private debts are paid off. So that money is self-liquidating. It's only the federal debt that never gets paid off. And that money stays in the system. So we have about 13 trillion in the money supply right now, and we have a $10 trillion federal debt. But basically the federal debt is the source of our money. So then you might ask, if the federal debt is the money supply, why didn't the government just issue the money instead of issuing it as debt and then turning it into money? And the answer is that at one time we did. The colonists issued their own money in the 18th century. It was a brilliant system invented by the American colonists, actually before the Bank of England. In 1690, the governor of Massachusetts was fighting a little war and he didn't have any money. They didn't have gold and silver. So he issued these little paper receipts to his soldiers and his workers that were legal tender. They were just little receipts acknowledging that goods and services had been delivered to the community. So you could take your little paper out and trade it for an equivalent in goods and services. Well, that money stayed out there. That was real money, real legal tender. It wasn't owed back. And because of that system, the colonies thrived. Benjamin Franklin was called the father of paper money because he thought it was such a great system. He said, there are three great friends, an old wife, an old dog, and ready money. So ready money was pretty much what we mean by credit. He said, many that understand business very well but have not a stock sufficient of their own will be encouraged to borrow money to trade with when they have it at a moderate interest. That was the beauty of the system. You could go and get credit, and somebody didn't have to dig it out of the ground first. Credit was something created by the community. It was basically your promise to pay later and their acknowledgement that you were a trustworthy person and could be trusted to pay later. So the Pennsylvania system had actually a brilliant system. It was mathematically sound, and this is what I think we should return to. They owned a bank. So instead of just some of the other colonies just printed and printed and printed, and that was not so good. That did inflate the money supply. But in Pennsylvania, because they got the money out there as a loan, but a government issued loan, in other words, a publicly issued, publicly controlled loan, here's an example. Let's say you printed $105. You would lend $100 at 5% interest. Then you could spend the other $5 on government needs, the budget. So you would have $105 out there in the economy. Then that $105 would all go to pay principal and interest on your loan. So the same $105 would come back to the government, and that same $105 could be lent, $100 lent and $5 spent. So you never have to inflate the system. It's circular, self-contained, and self-sustaining. So during the period that system was in place, Pennsylvania had no price inflation. They paid no taxes, and they had no government debt. That was the first half of the 18th century. So because of this, in the mid-18th century, Benjamin Franklin wrote, there was abundance in the colonies, and peace was reigning on every border. It was difficult and even impossible to find a happier and more prosperous nation on all the surface of the globe. Comfort was prevailing in every home. And the people in general kept the highest moral standards, and education was widely spread. And then when he was asked how that we could be so prosperous when in England there were people out of work and they were suffering the ravages of the Industrial Revolution, he said, that is simple. In the colonies we issue our own paper money. It is called colonial scrip. We issue it in proper proportion to make the goods pass easily from the producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating ourselves our own paper money, we control its purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay to no one. So that's the Industrial Revolution in England. England's system was different. It was the debt-based system, and it went. So where we had little paper receipts that were issued publicly by the government, in England they had paper receipts that were issued privately by banks. These are called banknotes, and it went back to the goldsmiths of the 17th century. The goldsmiths were entrusted with people's gold for safekeeping because people didn't want to carry it around. It was heavy and it was dangerous. And the goldsmiths issued these little paper receipts. Well, they soon discovered that they could issue many times more receipts than they had gold because people didn't come for their gold more than 10% of the time. It was basically the Madoff Ponzi scheme, you know, where he could continue. He could just pay out occasionally when people came for their money because there would always be more and more people that were paying in. And that system was institutionalized with the Bank of England in 1694 when the king needed money. And so a group of lenders were allowed to lend supposedly gold to the king. But again, they were lending their own paper receipts called the Bank of England banknotes. And they could lend and did lend many times more receipts than they had gold. So if you were lending 10 receipts for 10 to 1, then 9 of your paper receipts were counterfeit. There was no gold behind them. So meanwhile, in the colonies, some colonies were sort of abusing the system. They were printing and printing and printing. And the merchants complained that their money was being devalued. And so King George forbade them to issue their own currency. And according to Benjamin Franklin, that was the real reason we fought the revolution. It would be like if today, if the president said, sorry, you can't use your dollars anymore, you know, find something else. Well, we don't have anything else. So it wiped out the monetary system. So what the colonists did was they used their script anyway. They just continued doing it. So they defied the king, and that meant war. English historian John Twells said, issuing their own script was the monetary system under which America's colonies flourished to such an extent that Edmund Burke was able to write about them. Nothing in the history of the world resembles their progress. It was a sound and beneficial system, and its effects led to the happiness of the people. In a bad hour, the British Parliament took away from America its representative money, forbade any further issue of bills of credit, these bills ceasing to be legal tender, and ordered that all taxes should be paid in coins. Consider now the consequences. This restriction of the medium of exchange paralyzed all the industrial energies of the people. Ruin took place in these once flourishing colonies. Most rigorous distress visited every family and every business. Discontent became desperation and reached a point, to use the words of Dr. Johnson, when human nature rises up and asserts its rights. So that meant war, but the thing was the colonists didn't have any money. So they did something, it was a first, it had never been done before. They fought and won a war against a major world power with paper receipts. It worked brilliantly well, except for the fact that the British did an old ruse, and Napoleon used to do this when he would fight a country. He would go in and inflate their money supply. So that's what the British did. They had ships in the harbor that were busily printing Continentals and giving them away to anybody who wanted them. So that's why the Continental was devalued. That was the principal reason. It also was devalued because it had to compete with other currencies. And of course, anybody given the choice would take gold over the paper receipt of an army that might lose, or even of a province that had a more had a police force and had a more established economy. So by the end of the war, we won, but we lost the thing that Benjamin Franklin said we fought for. We lost our own paper money, or our own publicly issued money. The Founding Fathers were so disillusioned with this money that they couldn't agree whether to put it in the Constitution, so they just left it out. This is all the Constitution says about issuing money. The Congress shall have power to coin money, regulate the value thereof. Now, does that mean they can issue paper money? Probably not. They probably meant coin money. And then there's no mention of the other money that we use today, electronic money and checkbook money and so forth. So at best, the Constitution needs to be revised. Meanwhile, outside the Constitutional Convention, there were riots. The soldiers wanted their money and the farmers wanted their medium of exchange again. So Alexander Hamilton knew he had to do something. Also, the country was heavily in debt. They had borrowed from foreign powers and so forth. What they should have done was paid them all off in these paper receipts. But they couldn't really do that because not everybody would accept them. So Hamilton resorted to the ruse in England, which was to create a bank, the first U.S. bank, in which the government's money was put. All the government's gold was put in this bank, and then it was lent back to the government, but at many times the sum that it actually was. So it was leveraged into many times that sum in loans, paper banknotes, supposedly all backed by the gold. So it worked. It got the economy back on its feet, and it got the debts paid off. But of course, it did get us into this whole private banking, privately issued money system that we're now at the end of the mathematical possibilities of today. Jefferson was Hamilton's political rival, and he was very suspicious of what Hamilton did. But like Hamilton originally, he was opposed to paper money. He said, I now deny their power. I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment to our Constitution, taking from the federal government the power to borrow money. I now deny their power of making paper money or anything else a legal tender. That was in 1778. But in 1813, he came around to realizing that it wasn't what the money was made of. It was who issued it or who had control of it that was the important thing. He said, although we have so foolishly allowed the field of circulating medium to be filched from us by private individuals, I think we may recover it. The state should be asked to transfer the right of issuing paper money to Congress in perpetuity. He also said, the Treasury, lacking confidence in the country, delivered itself bound hand and foot to bold and bankrupt adventurers and bankers, pretending to have money, whom it could have crushed at any moment. And he said, and I sincerely believe that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale. So we've seen that today. Jefferson agitated to get the bank shut down, which it was, but then there was the charter was not immediately renewed, but then they came out with a second U.S. bank because of the War of 1815. So Andrew Jackson had that bank shut down, the second U.S. bank, and he said, if Congress has the right under the Constitution to issue paper money, it was given to them to use themselves, not to be delegated to individuals or corporations. In other words, if somebody had the power, it wasn't private bankers. But the problem was, after the second U.S. bank was shut down, we had no central bank, and we just had these wildcat banks. And so the whole money thing was very iffy. You know, you couldn't trust one currency, but all the currencies would get devalued relative to each other. So Abraham Lincoln was actually in favor of a central bank, but when he stepped into office, he immediately was faced with a war, and he had no money to fund it. And the British bankers were going to charge him 24 to 36% interest, highly usurious rates. So he knew that would bankrupt the country. So he valiantly went back to the system of the American colonists. He issued his own money, greenbacks. Again, it was a brilliant system. He won a war against the same major European power with paper receipts issued by the government. Those are some greenbacks. But again, the British bankers waged war against the greenbacks. This is a famous circular called the Hazard Circular. It was circulated by British interests among their American counterparts. It said, the great debt the capitalists will see to it is made out of the war must be used as a means to control the volume of money. They wanted to use bonds, in other words, government debt as the basis for money, and that's what we have today. So the National Bank Act that they got passed was the beginning of the Federal Reserve Act. It was the same principle that rather than allowing greenbacks to be the basis of the money supply. In other words, government receipts acknowledging goods and services delivered to the government. The basis of the money supply would be debt of the government to private parties. To accomplish this, the bonds must be used as a banking basis. It will not do to allow the greenback, as it is called, to circulate as money any length of time, as we cannot control that. By then, the British banking was dominated by the Rothschilds. In 1791, I'm sure you've heard this, but Amschel Rothschild famously said, he was the patriarch, he said, "Let me issue and control a nation's currency, and I care not who makes its laws." Well, that is the whole modus operandi of the private central banking system that we have today. It's gone around the world, the Bank for International Settlements, that's what they're aiming for, to create money privately and make it look like governments are creating it, and that governments are responsible for our problems. So they got the National Bank Act passed. It was a very good deal for the bankers because they had to put money on deposit in order to get these banknotes, but it was still their money, so they got it twice. They got the banknotes, which they could then lend and fan into more money, and they still had their money on deposit with the Treasury. This is a communication from the Rothschild brothers to an associate firm in New York. The few who understand the system will either be so interested in its profits or so dependent upon its favors that there will be no opposition from that class, while on the other hand, the great body of people, mentally incapable of comprehending, will bear its burdens without complaint. It sounds a lot like what we have going on today, where the insiders go along with it because they're making money off it, and everybody else doesn't get it, they don't understand it, and so they don't object. So the private bankers got control of the money supply, and there was a series of depressions and bank runs. The problem, of course, with the system was that they never had enough money to cover all their notes, and people would figure that out periodically, and they'd all come to the bank and demand their money at once, and when that happened, their gold, and when that happened, the bank would have to close its doors. And in the 1890s, there was particularly bad depression, and so there was this big populist movement, which is what I think we need to have again. It was led by William Jennings Bryan, and his whole pitch was that it was the government that had to issue the money, not a private issuance. He said at the Democratic Convention in 1896, "We say in our platform that we believe that the right to coin money and issue money is a function of government. Those who are opposed to this proposition tell us that the issue of money is a function of the bank and that the government ought to go out of the banking business. I stand with Jefferson and tell them as he did that the issue of money is a function of the government and that, I love this line, and that the banks should go out of the governing business. When we have restored the money of the Constitution, all other necessary reforms will be possible, and until that is done, there is no reform that can be accomplished. You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify man upon a cross of gold," this famous line. So in 1907, there was a particularly bad bank run, apparently actually instigated by J.P. Morgan. There's evidence of that. And then Morgan valiantly came through with money that he got from Europe, the Rothschilds no doubt, and saved the day. And so he organized this, he wanted to bring the Federal Reserve Act. Originally it was called the Aldrich Act. And Aldrich was a known Wall Street figure, and of course the opposition, including William Jennings Bryan, would have nothing of it because they were not going to allow privately issued money to be the national currency. So the Morgan Group changed the name to the Federal Reserve Act to make it look like it was actually federal. And it was so obscurely worded that William Jennings Bryan, who led the opposition to this act, actually endorsed it, and he was all excited, and he thought, finally, we'd gotten our way, we had our government-issued money. It's still obscurely worded. I can't figure it out. I've looked in there to see exactly where it says that the government can issue this $1.2 trillion that they just did to expand the money supply, and I don't necessarily see it in there. At the same time, I'm sure you all know this, in 1913 the 16th Amendment was passed authorizing the federal income tax, or supposedly authorizing it. I mean, there are many, I'm sure you've heard this in other talks, but there are flaws in it. It wasn't properly endorsed, etc. And the money originally all went to the Federal Reserve directly. It was set up specifically to pay the interest on this government debt that was now going to be owed to the private bankers. And today, interest on the federal debt consumes about 1/3 of income taxes. This is a statement from Carroll Quigley, who was professor of history at Georgetown University and was an insider groomed by the international bankers. He said, "The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans." So that's what we have going on now. He said in 1924, the chairman of the board of the Midland Bank said, "Banks can and do create money, and they who control the credit of the nation direct the policy of government." So the whole point of the Federal Reserve, and the reason it was passed, was to backstop bank runs, rather like the $700 billion bailout. But it obviously didn't work, because 20 years later, we had the worst bank run in history with the Great Depression. So Roosevelt had to do something. So he took the dollar off the gold standard. He's been criticized for that, but he really had no choice, because the dollar was 40% backed by gold, and everybody was not trusting their banks anymore, so they were all running to the bank with their dollars trying to get their gold out. Well, every time you got $2 worth of gold out, $3 worth of loans had to be called in. So the money supply was just collapsing in on itself, which is, again, what we have today. All these debts are canceling each other out, or not being renewed, and that's why we actually have a shrinking money supply, even though people are talking about inflation. It's really deflation. The other thing Roosevelt did, among other things, was to use the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was set up by Hoover, as a public funding institution to fund the New Deal and World War II. The only problem with that was it was actually a publicly owned bank, basically, but the problem was they borrowed the money before they lent it. So they were taking with one hand giving with one hand and taking with the other hand. They had to increase taxes in order to pay the loans. So how it would work better would be to use the Pennsylvania plan, where you don't borrow it first, you just lend it. You initiate the money as a loan, and then it comes back to you. So it's not like you create inflation. It goes out, it creates something productive, and the profits from that thing come back and pay off the loan. But it starts with the government. The government doesn't borrow it from the private bankers who initiate the money, or begin the money train. After the Depression, the approach of the Federal Reserve was, every time there was an appearance of a shrinkage of or a contraction of the economy, they would inflate the money supply. And to do that, you would have to increase debt, because that's the only way to get money out there. So we had this series of bubbles. After the savings and loans collapse in 1980, the stock market bubble of the 90s was created, and then that collapsed in 2000, and then the housing bubble was created to overcome that. This is the housing bubble. You can see that there's something very extraordinary about this. This is not an ordinary sort of bubble. And it was created by various devices, devious means. First of all, of course, they lowered the interest rates to very low levels. But besides that, they relaxed the lending standards. Basically, they eliminated lending standards. So anybody who walked in the door who was willing to sign on the dotted line could get a loan. And in order to, normally banks would not want to take on these risky loans, but the reason they were willing to was they figured out how to package up the loans and sell them off to investors. But, so you have here, it used to be you just had a relationship between the homeowner and the bank, but now the bank would then sell the loan to a third-party intermediary, and then it would go into these mortgage-backed securities, and then investors would buy them, and then they'd be tucked into these strange things called SIVs and so forth. So it got more and more remote from the borrower. And in order to get the investors to buy these things, which were actually full of dodgy debt, they were supposedly protected with derivatives, which are actually just insurance, but they didn't use the word. It was insurance against default. They sold off the risk to another set of investors, none of these investors really knew what they were getting. You know, it's like they would go, I read this, they would go to, say, school boards who were just mothers, you know, trying to do something good for their kids, and they would say, oh yeah, you really need some of these you need to buy some of this credit default swaps to protect your loans. I mean, they're buying stuff or selling stuff. They have no idea what they're getting into. Because they didn't use the word insurance against default, they didn't have to set aside reserves like a normal insurer would. So that's the whole flaw in the scheme. They're basically bets, and there's they're private bets. So there's no agency checking to make sure that the bettors actually have the money to pay up in the event of default. The other thing is, you don't have to own, like you can bet on the horse without owning the horse. You can bet on your neighbor's house burning down without owning the house. So you can bet on the price of tea in China. You can bet on anything. So the derivatives scheme got to be so popular because it was a form of gambling, and you could have like 10 times as many bets on the default of General Motors as General Motors is worth. I think that's about what it is now. So the upshot was that there is now over $1 quadrillion in derivatives trades, according to the Bank for International Settlements in the last year. Well, that was, when I was a kid, we used to use the word quadrillion for, you know, I'll bet you $1 quadrillion. I mean, it's like a number that couldn't exist, and it is an impossible number. This is the end of a Ponzi scheme. There is no way we can bail out $1 quadrillion derivatives gamble. Or if you want to use the more moderate numbers, it's 62 trillion for credit default swaps on the books of U.S. banks. It's 165 trillion for derivatives on the books of U.S. banks, and they're basically three or five big banks, and those are the banks who are pouring money down this black hole. We can't possibly solve the problem that way. So here's an interesting chart. The derivatives. This is the derivatives exposure of U.S. banks. Bank of America, 38 trillion. This is out of a total of 165 trillion as of last December, I think. 38 trillion on the books of Bank of America, 90 trillion on the books of JP Morgan, 38 trillion on the books of Citigroup. That's like 3 banks. You could just, here's what I would argue, you should just let them go bankrupt, impose the FDIC receiver, clear their books. Like, you don't bail them out. What they're calling nationalization now is, with Citigroup, for instance, we've paid enough to buy all of Citigroup, but instead we the public own 38%, and what they're using the public for is taxpayer money is going to pour money down this black hole of trying to clean up the books and leaving the profits and the control of the entity in private hands. And I mean, I heard them say this on CNBC. It's like, okay, they're calling it nationalization, but don't worry, because the whole idea is the government will just be in there long enough to clean up the books, and then they're going to sell it back to the private investors. Well, that's what the government tends to do. You know, we bear the risk, and then somebody else gets the profits. But what you could do, those 3 banks alone have branches in every city. If you just one of those three banks, if just one of them, first you put it through bankruptcy, which means you don't use taxpayer money to pay off the creditors. The creditors stand in line according to seniority, and they get paid the money that's there. So then you have a clean set of books. Then you nationalize it. take it over as a public entity, you would have a public banking system. You would have branches in every single city just by nationalizing one of those three. So Jefferson's solution was the issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. And I would agree with that. But many people say that would be inflationary. That's the big objection to letting the government issue the money, is that they would irresponsibly print. Well, it all goes back to the Revolutionary War. In fact, Congress was very responsible. The Continental Congress set a ceiling on how much they would print, and they never printed anymore. One thing is that bankers can issue money and they don't even have to ask. They just keep issuing it. Whereas Congress, at least they have to vote on it, and everybody has to talk about it. Here you see, this is a chart of inflation. You can see that during the 18th century, there was virtually no inflation when we had the publicly issued money. And also in the 19th century, there was little inflation. There was, but what happened was it would inflate, and then to the extent that until all the gold would act as a tether, so they could only inflate a certain amount, and then it would collapse into depression. There'd be bank runs. So it was a very painful way to get there, but you had these waves of inflation and depression. But it did keep the price level relatively stable. So we really only had major inflation here. This is with the Federal Reserve Act, and when the Federal Reserve note was our money supply, bank-issued money. Another way to look at it is it depends on what you use the money for. If you use it for productive things, if you use it like Zimbabwe to pay off a foreign creditor who knows you're coming, and the speculators know you're coming, and so know that you're desperate for dollars, they will speculate your currency to death. And that's what happened to Zimbabwe, not the fact that they were printing money to fund their internal development. But if you use it for internal productive purposes, prices only go up when demand exceeds supply. In other words, when you have more money competing for the same number of goods. But if you use that money to create more goods, prices will remain stable. In this chart, for instance, you have if you have $100 competing for 100 widgets, the price will be $1. If you add money to the money supply, so you have $1,000 competing for 100 widgets, the price will be $10. But if you use that $1,000 to make 1,000 widgets, the price will still be $1. Another way to look at it is these figures are from Richard Cook. This was in 2006. We did not have the money to buy our own products. This is the income, like wages, salaries, etc., of the American people. Only came to $10 trillion. And the gross domestic product came to $13 trillion. But we did buy this product. So where did this other $3 trillion come from? This was created on the books of banks. And in fact, not all this $10 trillion was spent on products. Some of it was saved and invested. So there was only $9 trillion to be spent on $13 trillion in products. And we were not in full employment. So if we were, we could have you could add, on this chart, you could add $5.5 trillion to the money supply without inflating prices. You'd just be bringing the money up to the level of the goods and services if you took away the right of the banks to create the money. So there are this is my 4-point plan here. There are 4 ways that you could create, that you could return money and banking to public oversight and control. The obvious direct way would be to nationalize the Federal Reserve. But that's controversial. Dwight Patman tried to do that in the 60s, and of course he couldn't do it. But what he did succeed in doing was, in order to stay alive, the Federal Reserve agreed to rebate the interest. Well, on the debt that the interest that the government paid to the Federal Reserve is now rebated to the government. Well, that's an interesting fact. This 1.2 trillion that the government, or that the Federal Reserve just created on their books, they spent it, they made those loans to banks, credit card companies, private entities. But what if Obama said, monetize my $900 billion stimulus plan? The Congress, even though the Federal Reserve is private, they get their charter from Congress, so Congress could certainly say, turn this $900 billion stimulus package into money, and then rebate the interest. In other words, it's interest-free money, and because the federal debt is never ever paid off, its interest-free loans rolled over indefinitely are the same as government-issued money. So that would be a way to do it that's totally legal. It's totally what they're doing right now, and in fact, that's pretty much, the Federal Reserve has said recently that they were talking about monetizing or lending the money for long-term government debt. So in order to stimulate the economy, in other words, they're talking about actually funding the government's debt. So that would solve a lot of problems. If every time right now we have this problem with the Chinese they're losing interest in buying our debt, and everybody's worried what happens when they don't want our debt anymore and they raise interest rates and we can't afford to pay, etc. Well, what if when we just pay off those loans as they come due? They're always paid off, but then what they do is they borrow the money for more bonds in order to refinance them. So what if you just paid them off with money issued by the Federal Reserve, and then when the Chinese came the next time around, we would say, we're not selling any more bonds, we're now funding our debt through our own central bank, debt interest-free. So a third option, a second option would have been to nationalize bankrupt banks such as Citigroup, put them through FDIC receivership, and then take them over as public entities. So the fourth option, which is where I think we should really start, that's something that we could do. We could form a lobby and petition to have this happen, is to have state-owned banks. There are 46 of 50 states are now bankrupt and may be filing Chapter 9 bankruptcy proceedings in the next 2 years. One of the 4 that isn't bankrupt is a very unlikely candidate, North Dakota. It's a cold state with just isolated farmers. So why are they doing so well? The reason is in 1919, they had a populist movement. They were Scandinavian farmers who were, their money was being siphoned off to these Wall Street bankers and to the railroads. So in order to keep their money in the state, they formed a state-owned bank. States are not allowed to issue their own money, but there's no law that says that a state cannot own a bank. And since they've done it since 1919, we can, we've got precedent here. So by law, the North Dakota government puts all their revenues in the Bank of North Dakota. Then they do what any bank does. They fan that into 10 times that sum in loans. So suddenly they have plenty of credit. They make loans to farmers at 1% interest. And they have lots of money for their student loans. And what they could do, theoretically, what a state could do, it could, because it owns the bank, it could lend to itself at 0% interest. And it could roll those loans over indefinitely. In other words, it would be a form of creating your own money or creating your own credit. And then you would have control over who got this credit. And because it would be interest-free, you would reduce the cost of projects in general by 50% if you eliminated interest. So all those things that we think we can't afford, like say solar energy or something, we say, well, it's a nice idea, but it's just not self-sustaining, it doesn't pay enough. But if you took the interest out of it, you would cut the cost in half, and it would be self-sustaining. Not only that, it would actually generate a profit. So that was pretty long, but there's more, and it's in my book, Web of Debt. I've written this on the theme is the Wizard of Oz, which was actually written in the 1890s as a monetary allegory. If you know Bill Still, he asked me to say this, so I will. Bill Still made the movie The Money Masters. I guess he's spoken here before. Well, he's now making a sequel called The Secret of Oz, which is basically the theme of my book, and I'm in it. I'm not very good in it, but anyway, I'm in it. So that's it. Thank you very much.